Welcome to Meta Modern Radio. And today I want to talk about the concept of antifragility and skin in the game, initially proposed by Nassim Taleb, and how it relates to the current steady decline of both the trust in and the success of the mainstream media, which is something that I'm extremely happy about. So, Nassim Taleb is, in my opinion, a real genius and extremely original thinker. I've been reading his books, Skin in the Game and Antifragile, recently, and they've changed my perspective on things completely, and I'd really recommend these to anybody. So the concept of antifragility, basically, it's the true opposite of fragility. Not that something doesn't get damaged when it is attacked, but something that actually improves as a result of perturbing feedback or sort of potentially damaging feedback, in the way that a person who experiences hardship will come out stronger at the end of it. So although this term has hit the zeitgeist in a big way recently, a lot of people hear the sort of definition of what it means without getting a lot of the in-depth explanation of the concept and what actually makes a system anti-fragile, and what happens when you deprive anti-fragile systems of the kind of necessary negative feedback that they require in order to strengthen. So I want to talk about Nassim Taleb's explanation of fragility and anti-fragility, and how once I started to understand it, it gave me a completely different perspective on why the mainstream media narrative is failing so badly in a way that wasn't obvious to me originally, and it really I don't see very much or any discussion of it generally. So to explain antifragility beyond just a sort of simple definitional statement, let's look at the example of a person and why people are antifragile. The way we think isn't just, the way a person approaches the world isn't just one single approach. It's a extremely complicated and massively interactive system of different ideas, ways of looking at things, ways of thinking about things, and general habits. And so when a person experiences something bad, if they're able to figure out what it was that they did that caused that bad thing to happen and stop doing it, the system itself is able to carry forward while the one part of it that was shitty dies. So what really makes an anti-fragile system is this massive hyper-interactivity between many components. And one of the interesting things about them is that they're usually, or almost always, much too complicated to analyze and make massive hierarchical changes to. And so usually the best thing to do with them is to just allow them to experience the natural negative feedback of the environment that they're meant for, just so that they can sort of make these microscopic self-corrections. So the more of this hyper-interactivity, the better. So a company can be anti-fragile if it's effective at getting rid of employees or business practices that are ineffective. But what's way more anti-fragile than that is the economy itself that sits above it. Because as the business itself fails, then the economy can benefit because it's gotten rid of this unfit part of it. So without really getting into it, this is why I'm so intensely suspicious of massively top-down economic systems like state communism. Because what people really misunderstand about economic systems that utilize capitalism as an engine is that capitalist economic theory doesn't actually describe the result that comes out of it. All it does is explain sort of rules by which the individual elements of the system interact. So we don't really live in an economic system described by capitalism, but what we live in is a infinitely interactive system with millions of corporations and even more consumers, all of which in of themselves have an infinite complexity, and that organize themselves through and improve themselves collectively through an anti-fragile process of continual deletion and allowing the sort of cream to rise to the top. Not that I think that this sort of thing doesn't have certain runaway incentives or anything like that, or that there's no necessity for government intervention. It's just that the idea that you could take such a complicated thing and think that you could, piece by piece, put together something of equivalent quality to yourself is insane. And also, Yeah, it's insane. And also, you should be kind of careful about government regulation because it's going to produce an infinite amount of effects that you did not intend at the same time that it maybe produces the effect that you intend as well. So that's the beauty of Nassim Taleb's ideas on anti-fragility, is that we have an extremely difficult time, and it's often impossible to design hyper-complex systems that have that level of interactivity and actually make them effective. But what we can do is sort of set rules of interaction that cause naturally antifragile systems to emerge and self-improve over time. I guess one interesting thing you could say about this is that in reality, like the ultimate and probably the original antifragile system is evolution itself. And then what comes from evolution is you have species, where certain members of the species will die off due to lack of fitness, and then certain species will die off due to lack of fitness. Then intelligence emerges, and so you're able to think and learn in a way that without you dying in yourself, certain things about you die and improve themselves. And then you start to produce economies which have this sort of hyper interactivity that are anti-fragile as well. So it's really interesting how the birth of evolution created this massive cascade of different layered anti-fragile systems. So this is where the other book, the other concept of skin in the game comes in. What happens when a system that has this sort of like anti-fragile setup? What happens when it's deprived of that continual negative and perturbing feedback that's supposed to cause it to steadily improve and prune itself through deletion? So if you have one of these complex systems and you fail to expose it to the kind of real world skin in the game damaging impact that it needs to prune itself, then all of the elements that would get removed in every one of these events just continually accumulate over and over again. And over time you end up with this massive amount of highly pathological operators within your system. And the system will transform from an anti-fragile one that can gain from disorder into a fragile one. And even though you try to shelter it from risk, eventually something's going to come along that you didn't prepare for. And all of that pathological bullshit will collapse at once and your entire system will fail. So one of the most interesting things about Nassim Taleb is that he was a trader, like a stock trader, and he actually successfully made money in all three of the financial crises that occurred in his lifetime. So the 1987 Black Monday crash, the 1999-2000 dot-com bubble crash, and of course the most recent and famous 2008 housing market crash. So I promise I'm going to get to the media pretty soon. But anyway, Nassim Taleb's simple explanation for the 2008 financial crisis, and of course he was one of the famous predictors of it, and so history is really on his side here, was that the banks were able to structure their investments in such a way that they could protect themselves from the downsides while simultaneously benefiting from the upsides of the investment. So essentially, they're risk laundering in a way that was difficult to detect because of the hypercomplexity to the customers that they would unsuspectingly sort of push the risk off onto. And he had it's not the same complicated analytical explanation which goes and looks at the mortgage-backed securities and all this kind of stuff. But the nice thing about it is that you don't actually need to get that analytically lucky to notice the problem if you're thinking in this way, which means that it's actually much more reliable, because we don't really, we know eventually there will be some other kind of financial crisis, but it's not going to be another mortgage-backed securities one. So we need some kind of reliable analytical method that isn't just going to be working after the fact. And so he just knew that because of the fact that we had a large economy that had these like very central and fundamentally like voluminous entities that were protecting themselves from their own failures, he knew that there was going to be a bullshit accumulation in the economy, and so the economy was fundamentally fragile because of all of this like pathological operation that was not able to receive the negative pruning feedback from the environment that it needed. So I'm nothing like an expert on economics, but I wanted to use that example because that was sort of the way that Taleb was able to prove himself with these ideas most dramatically. And I really wanted to kind of explain it in depth so that you get an idea of how these sorts of operations almost function as a kind of law of nature. And so then we can move on, and now we get to the media. So The media is like the news media is a sort of conversation in a sense. So if you have like a conversational substrate or a large amount of actors who are engaging in conversations with each other, that is that variety of highly interconnected system. And so Taleb describes the antifragile nature of a distributed, interconnected conversation. Information transmits organically by word of mouth, which circulates in a two-way manner. In ancient Rome, people got information without a centralized filter. In the ancient Mediterranean marketplaces, people talked. They were the receivers and the purveyors of news. Barbers offered comprehensive services as news reporters. If people were left to filter their own rumors, they were also part of the transmission. Same with pubs in London and coffee houses. In the Eastern Mediterranean, currently Greece and the Levant, condolences were the source of gathering and transmission, and represented the bulk of social life. Dissemination of news took place at these gatherings. My social grandmother would have her rounds of visits of condolences some days in Beirut's then significant Greek Orthodox community, and knew practically everything down to the most insignificant details. If the child of someone prominent flunked an exam, she knew it. Practically every affair in town was detected. Unreliable people carried less weight than reliable ones. You can't fool people more than twice. So any kind of conversational system is the kind of massively interconnected anti-fragile system that I've been talking about. And it's able to strengthen itself because people who lie or manipulate have their signal sort of downgraded because their reputation is damaged. And the mechanism by which their reputation is damaged is the fact that every conversation is two ways. So all of the people who receive information in this interconnected conversation are also inputting information. So one of the things, the pieces of information that gets put back into the conversation is like, have I been lied to by a particular person? So the news media is actually quite a unique kind of conversation, which is a very large and ongoing one-sided conversation. And you'll notice that the one thing that's missing is that kind of reverse feedback where the people who are just ordinary readers or listeners paying attention to the media, if they notice that they've been lied to or if something bad happens, they don't get to put that feedback back into the system that can correct for it. And so even though it's true that there was certain amounts of publicized criticisms of the media back in the day, most of that was just from other sources in the media. So imagine how fucked up the situation would have been over the past couple of years if every time Jordan Peterson had to refute massive lies about him in the media, which to me really, the insanity of the mainstream narrative that was being produced around him was really the kind of big red pill that made me realize that the mainstream media has just completely fucking lost their shit. But imagine if every time that happened to him, in order to sort of publicly address them, he had to do that through the media himself. So he'd have to go on TV somewhere and hope that they were gracious enough to even invite him, which they might not. And if they did, that they would actually cut together what he said in a favorable way. Because as we know, most of these interview shows, they'll sit down and interview somebody for like fucking 3 hours or something and then just cut it together and give you 5 or 6 minutes of what they actually said, which is insanity. And so we see tons of evidence of this, the continual bringing up of this erroneous 77% on the dollar wage gap myth, which, obviously men choose different careers, men are working longer hours, they work more dangerous jobs, they're more willing to move for work. Despite the fact that all of these things get ignored in this figure, you keep hearing this shit get pushed over and over and over again. And that's why, it was so funny when Kathy Newman was pressing Jordan Peterson about it, and it's like, lady, have you even Googled this shit? Jesus Christ. There was one time where Obama even hired a research committee to look into the 77% figure, and they actually came back to him with this same response. And yet he still ended up talking about it in a speech to his, one of his very motivational sort of progressive speeches. These days a woman only earns 77 cents for every dollar a man earns.
Today, the typical woman who works full-time earns 79 cents for every dollar that a typical man makes. And the gap is even wider for women of color. The typical black woman makes only 60 cents. A Latino woman, 55 cents for every dollar that a white man earns. If we truly value fairness,
Look at that
then America should be
dislike
a level
bar,
playing
man.
field
Oh,
where
man.
everyone who works hard
Well,
gets a chance to
I
succeed.
think we can say it looks like the two-way conversation has started again. You know, you know what I mean, man? So anyway, Nassim Taleb says, the period of time that corresponds to reliance on one-sided accounts such as television and newspapers, which can be controlled by the mandarins, lasted from the middle of the 20th century until the U.S. election of 2016. At that point, social networks, allowing a two-way flow of information, returned the mechanism of tidings to its natural format. So you sort of get the idea. You know, a lot of people make complicated analytical arguments about the nature of the bizarre narrative that's sort of being cycled through the media continually. But Nassim's perspective is... Now, I really like a lot of those explanations, and I think they're important. I'm not trying to say that, you know, it's this perspective or the other, and I'm sure that Nassim Taleb wouldn't make that statement either. But the anti-fragile versus fragile explanation kind of offers an ideologically independent explanation that doesn't require you to know the nature of the pathological ideology that ends up emerging. Just predicts that something of that nature will happen if you have continual conversations that protect themselves and isolate themselves from the negative feedback that they need. I mean, just look at the difference between the way Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama talked about the anti-Muslim Christchurch shootings in New Zealand and the anti-Christian church bombings that happened in Sri Lanka on Easter. Now, I'm not going to go and dig into this whole thing and make a large political point. It's just, it's so fucking weird that, like, the way this whole thing is, these things are framed, it's like, why the fuck are you using a euphemism for Christians? There's obviously a huge problem with Christians being killed in a lot of Muslim countries. It's a global problem. Why are you being euphemistic about it? And this whole thing is just so creepy, and there's no way that you would ever say something like this if you actually saw yourself as like a partner in a conversation that you're actually going to be receiving replies in. And the way it gets picked up by so many people is just so creepy. Even the mayor of my city is jumping on this weird fucking Easter worshippers bandwagon. It's a weird clown world shit, man. But the point is that the reason why we're in this fucking clown world is because any dialogue that has successfully figured out a way of sheltering itself from outside criticism will inevitably develop an intense form of ideological cancer. There is a true inevitability to this process. We're in the middle of a ideological and philosophical bubble of the same scale as the financial bubble that we experienced in 2008. And we're most certainly headed for a crash if we can't rewrite things soon enough. But it seems like with the advent of social media and this reintroduction of the grassroots normal person voice in the conversation, we might, have a way of turning this thing around. I guess the only hope is that these, the old guards of the political establishment and the mainstream media, the people who have been kind of like propping this shit up, either finally accept the negative feedback that they're getting or just die off. We want the banks and the bankers who caused the financial crisis to fuck off and die, and then allow, whatever the new thing is to come up and replace it. And that's, essentially in the same situation. That's sort of the metaphor that I'm using. So here's the interesting and sort of spooky note that I want to leave you with. If it really is the case that we're not actually in a, crazy time for the media as much as we think we are, it's just that we've finally been able to produce a grassroots meta-narrative that can run alongside like the actual media narrative that we're being fed, and do this sort of monitoring process, if that's really the case, then how long has the media been as shitty as it is now? And maybe we're only just waking up to it. This is the alternate interpretation that I'm really interested in. How long have we been getting fucked around for? So I came up with a very interesting analogy, and when this occurred to me, it really hammered home to me just how intensely powerful these grassroots, distributed, sort of anti-fragile meta conversations can be that ordinary people have been generating online. So I do not like the new seasons of Game of Thrones very much, but I was really into the show when it first came out. I started watching since season 1, and then I ended up getting into the books and reading all of them. And there was a very interesting fan theory that emerged out of this sort of chaotic internet dialogue about the show, which is a big spoiler, so skip ahead a bit if you don't want it. And it's that Jon Snow, the bastard son of Ned Stark, was actually secretly Ned's sister's son, who she had with Rhaegar Targaryen, making Jon Snow the true heir to the Iron Throne in the Kingdom of Westeros. And it also meant that the entire war that caused the Targaryens to lose the throne was also perpetrated on false pretenses. So it's this crazy thing, and there's a really complicated fan theory explaining that originally came out of some, a couple of guys were sort of spitballing this idea on a forum in 1998, and then it started to percolate in a few other forums later on, and then once it had kind of solidified into a true theory, it spread widely all over the Game of Thrones subreddits and kind of became like a common knowledge, extremely likely fan theory. So the author George R. R. Martin is a real genius, and those novels are insanely complex. Not only that, but like he took extremely great care to hide these small little hints extremely subtly. And he had much help from his editor. He talks about this in interviews, how they made it so it would be almost impossible to figure out, and maybe only the most obsessive and attentive and clever extreme fans would ever be able to figure it out. And I'm a pretty smart guy. I think I'm a pretty clever guy, and I was a big fan of these books, but there is absolutely no way that I would have ever figured something like that out for myself, or even suspected that there might be something like that in there hidden if I were to go looking. You know what I mean? And yet, as the fourth season of the show was coming out, and as I was reading, I already knew that this thing was going to be happening later on because of how intensely convincing this complex theory is. And George R. R. Martin, when he found out that some people had figured it out, was really impressed. And so this is the fucking crazy thing about these distributed dialogues, is that everybody who's interested in looking into it can have the same level of clairvoyance as a 1 in 100,000 or a 1 in a million intense analytical fan of the work. And so what's crazy about this is that the meta dialogue that has now appeared alongside the sort of mainstream media, mainstream political narrative is of the same nature. And that's why the mainstream narrative is falling apart so badly, because there's so many holes in it that are just completely plainly obvious to everybody that most people didn't really notice before. It's like, this is what it's like, and I think this is fucking crazy, but watching the news back in the day was like finding the Song of Ice and Fire series, or the Game of Thrones series, whatever, and reading them with your friends, and you have some discussions about them, and that's about what you can figure out. Watching the media now is like being on this insanely complicated subreddit community that's got all kinds of crazy networked fan theories that they're sharing with each other, and like an extremely intense elucidation of minor and yet extremely important details that an ordinary person would not only fail to notice, but certainly fail to figure out how to fit, in with like a larger picture and actually come up with some kind of explanation. So if the statement is that the media has always been bizarre and dishonest in, like a wide variety of different ways, why is it that it seems so crazy now? Like even with the explanation that we're just more aware than we used to be, it still does seem crazier. And I do think it is, but what I believe is happening, and this really got triggered by the fact that Trump got elected, who really, he fundamentally is the candidate of the two-way conversation, whatever you think about him. The fact is that he emerged as a result of being involved in a conversation that he was in control of and didn't need to pass through the media. And then, you have a figure like Jordan Peterson coming out, and a lot of journalists and publications that speak kind of reasonably about the subjects that they want to speak reasonably about would go fucking insane and just make up the most bizarre and really defamatory lies about this guy. All that's happening now is that this incredibly fragile political narrative that has been accumulating fragility and pathology for a very long time is trying to make its last-ditch attempts to protect itself against the negative feedback that is going to cause it to, probably completely collapse in on itself. So you see this continual push to invalidate the grassroots voices. When Donald Trump wins the elections, it's the Russian hacking, it's fake news. When people don't like overly politicized movies, it's a bunch of angry trolls who are brigading the ratings. Or, the only people who like Jordan Peterson are angry white male incels. And then finally, and the biggest thing is this massive push to remove these skeptical voices from all of the distributed social media platforms where these anti-fragile dialogues are supposed to take place. So ultimately what it comes to is a desperate attempt to just stop the discussion from happening altogether. But the thing is, this is a true bubble, and the mainstream media and the old guard political establishment are as important for our philosophical and political substrate as the major banks in America were to that nation's economy and the world's economy. And the shitty ideas that have metastasized within these networks have embedded themselves in the way almost everybody thinks, and in the way that we've organized many of our institutions, the way we teach our children, and in this almost like unendingly complicated way. So I don't really know what it means when a ideological bubble collapses, but I guess the thing is, no matter what they do to try and prevent grassroots conversations from causing this collapse, the fact of the continued metastasization and the inevitable conflicts that bad ideas have with the natural world, there is some kind of collapse going to happen. And so I guess why it's so important to make sure that we prevent the ostracization of contrarian voices in this like extremely crucial time is that if this collapse is going to happen, we have to make sure that it's just the pathological elements of our entire sort of philosophical system that die off, and that they don't cause such a sort of horrible ripple effect that they just ruin everything. So this is an incredibly complicated and crazy sort of transient period, but if we can successfully get through it, and we can turn the temperature down on this political polarization that's kind of wasting everybody's energy and turning everybody against each other, then there's a really amazing opportunity to harness this new, massively distributed, anti-fragile, collaborative dialogue to produce way more effective and anti-fragile philosophical, political, and cultural models for moving forward into the future, which could be a really amazing thing if we actually pull it off. So that's the idea. I hope you found something interesting or useful in there. Definitely let me know what you think if you have any ideas. I'm always extremely interested to read what people have to say. I'm not just bullshitting. I kind of obsessively read almost all of the comments in my other videos. Maybe it's just because I'm kind of new at this, but I really appreciate it. And definitely subscribe, because if you enjoyed any of these videos, I'm going to keep going with it, man. I got a lot of other ideas on the back burner that I'd like to talk about. And if you really appreciate what I'm doing, I just opened up a Patreon, and it doesn't really take a lot, nothing like a coffee a month or something like that is really all it costs. And I really think grassroots media is extremely important. So if you're not going to support me, I think it's a good idea to support somebody who has a voice that is really valuable to you, because the institutional voices are nah. And if you really appreciate what I'm doing, I just recently opened up a Patreon, and I would be extremely grateful of any support that anybody has to offer to me. I really want to make this a serious thing, and any amount of money that I get will help me to free up more time to work on my videos, make them better, do more research, improve my perspective. I really think grassroots media is especially important now, most particularly because the institutions, they're kind of trying to pick winners in this fight as it is. So if you're not interested in supporting me, definitely I think you should support somebody who has a voice that you think is really good and valuable. So yeah, but this has been Metamodern Radio. I'm very appreciative that you watched the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and take care.